Hey there everyone, welcome to Software's classes. So in front of you is a question from RBI DPER. Okay, so this question was asked in the RBI DEPR examination. The question in front of you is about the fall of Bretton Woods. Okay, so discuss the evolution of international monetary system from the collapse of the Bretton Woods arrangements in 1971. What are the features of the present international monetary system, right? Now, let us discuss the points one by one. So, now, first of all, the Bretton Woods Agreement was negotiated in July 1944 by the delegates from 44 countries at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference held in Bretton Woods. Thus, the name Bretton Woods Agreement. So, the name is derived from the place where the conference was held. Now, under the Bretton Woods system, gold was the basis for the US dollar, right? So gold was the basis for the US dollar and the other currencies were pegged to the US dollar's values. Now the Bretton Woods system effectively came to an end in the early 1970s when the President Richard M. Nixon announced that the US would no longer exchange gold for US. So this was the reason behind the fall of Bretton Woods. Right? So approximately 730 delegates representing 44 countries at that time met in the Bretton Woods in July 1944 with the principal goal of creating an efficient foreign exchange system, preventing competitive devaluation of currencies and promoting international economic growth. So let us mark it as very important. What were the objectives of forming this Bretton Woods agreement, right? So they are as the follows, that is preventing competitive devaluation of currencies, promoting international economic growth, correct? Apart from that, creating an efficient foreign exchange system. So the Bretton Woods Agreement also created the two important organizations. This is very important, that is, we know IMF and World Bank, right? So this was under this Bretton Woods Agreement that the International Monetary Fund and World Bank was these two organizations were established. While the Bretton Woods system was dissolved in 1970s, both the IMF and World Bank have remained strong pillars for the exchange of international currencies, right? So the IMF and the World Bank, so basically in the Bretton Woods Agreement created these two institutions, IMF and World Bank, and formally introduced in December 1945, both institutions have withstood the test of the time globally, serving as important pillars for international capital financing and trade activities. So these two were mainly for the international capital financing and trade activities. So these were the reason behind formation of these two institutes. Even after the collapse of the Bretton Woods, these two continues to work towards their goals and are standing strongly, right? So the purpose of the IMF was to monitor exchange rates and identify nations that needed global monetary support, right? And World Bank, literally initially called International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that is our IRBD, right? That is International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, IBRD. Later on it was named as World Bank. So this was established to manage the funds available, providing assistance to countries that have been physically and financially devastated by World War II. So this was actually in order to help the developing countries together so that they have some monetary support, financial support, in order to have in order for the economy to grow, because due to the World War the economy was devastated. So they needed financial aids and support and help and maybe loans at a very low level of interest rate in order to so that they are able to invest, right? Invest, thus creating jobs, purchasing power and economic growth. So that is why these two institutions were the pillars during that time. Now let us try to understand the reason behind the collapse of the Bretton Woods, right? So Bretton Woods basically 1971 concerned that in 1971 concerned that US gold supply was no longer adequate to cover the number of dollars in circulation. So President Richard Nixon devalued the US dollars relative to gold. So this was one drastic step that was taken by the president at that time. So after a run on gold reserve, he declared a temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. So he suspended earlier the it was gold against US dollars. So due to the fall in the gold reserves, so it has suspended the dollar convertibility into gold for some time. So by 1973, the Bretton Woods system had collapsed. Now countries were then free to choose any exchange arrangement for their currency except pegging its value to the prior of gold. So the countries were allowed to peg their currency relative to whatever, but not the gold. So as a result, it was the Bretton Woods that used to peg against the gold and was measured as per the US dollar. So once it was suspended, so it was not allowed to peg the currency value against the gold. So they could, for example, link its value to another country's currency, a basket of currencies, or simply left it float freely and allow the market force to determine its value relative to other currencies. So they were allowed to peg their value of the currency relative to any other countries, or even if they don't want to, that was also allowed. They let it float freely in the market and let the exchange market determine the exchange rate. But whatever it is, the countries were not allowed to peg their value against the gold of the US dollars, right? So that was the reason. So the Bretton Woods agreement remains a significant event in the world financial history. The two Bretton Woods institutions created in the is the International Monetary Fund and World Bank played an important role in helping to rebuild Europe in the aftermath of World War II. Subsequently, both institutions have continued to maintain the founding goals with which also transitioning to several global government interests in the modern day. That is basically reconstructing and helping the less developing nations to grow and walk towards the path of economic growth, right? Now let us talk about the evolution of the monetary system after the collapse of the Bretton Woods, right? So to start with, basically, so the international monetary system consists of number one, exchange rate arrangements, number two, capital flows, and number three is a collection of institutions, rules, and conventions that govern its operation. The domestic monetary policy frameworks and are essential to the global system. So, a well functioning system promotes economic growth and prosperity through the efficient allocation of resources, increased specialization in production based on comparative advantage, and the diversification of risk. It also encourages macroeconomic and financial stability by adjusting real exchange rates to shift in trade and capital flows. So now in order to be effective, what happened? To be effective, the international monetary system must deliver both the sufficient nominal stability in the exchange rate and domestic prices and timely adjustment to shocks and structural changes, right? So attaining this balance can be very difficult. Now, changes in geographic distribution of economic and political power, global integration of goods and asset markets, wars, and consistent monetary and fiscal policies all have potential to undermine a monetary system. Now, past systems could not incent systematic countries to adjust policies in a timely manner. Now, the question is whether the current shock of integrating one third of humanity into global economy, positive as it is, will overwhelm the adjustment of mechanism in the current system or not. So the reasons behind this concern are as follows. There are different reasons behind this concern. So to start with, basically, there are reasons for concern like China's integration into the global economy alone represents a much bigger shock to the system than the emergence of the United States at the turn of the last century, right? Now, China's share of global GDP has increased faster and its economy is much more open as well, unlike the situation when United Nations was on the gold standard with all the other major countries. China's managed exchange rate regime today is distinct from the market-based floating rates of other major economies. So history shows the systems dominated by fixed or pegged exchange rates seldom cope well with the major shocks to the economy and structural shocks. So this failure was the result of two pervasive problems, that is asymmetric adjustment process and downward rigidity of nominal prices and wages. So in the short run, it is generally much less costly economically as well as politically for countries with balance of payment surplus to weak surplus and accumulate reserves than it is to deficit countries to sustain deficit. Now, this is because the only limit on reserve accumulation is its ultimate impact on domestic prices, depending on the openness of the financial system and degree of sterilization. This can be delayed for a very long time. In contrast, deficit countries must either deflate or run down the reserves. Now, talking about the flexible exchange rate, so what happens, the flexible exchange rate prevents basically the problem by providing less costly and more symmetric adjustment. Relative wages and prices can always quickly to the shocks through nominal exchange rate movements in order to restore external balance. So when the exchange rate floats, there is a liquid foreign exchange reserve that is most fundamentally floating exchange rate outcomes in the innate tendency of countries to delay adjustments. So, a brief review of how different international monetary regimes fail to manage this trade off can be as follows, right? So, what are the topics then? The first one is to reduce overall demand for reserves. Alternatives include regional reserve pooling mechanism and enhanced lending and insurance facilities at the IMF. So this is from the demand side. Now on the supply side, several alternative reserve assets have been suggested, like the motivation of the proposals of the primary to redistribute the so-called exorbitant privileges that occurs to the United States as the principal supplier of reserve currency, right? So as such, the United States reserve an advantage in the form of lowering the financing cost in its own currency. So this advantage would be shared and possibly reduced in aggregate if there were competing reserve currencies in turn. This could marginally reduce the collective famous of the currency notes. That means it's like if it is the only in the power, then there is kind of a monopoly. So if there is any other currency to compete with the US currency, then it can actually cut its financial cost to make its currency superior, right? So there are other ways, that is, one is increased use of special drawing rights, okay? Then what are the other purpose of IMF is to apply here a substitution account. Okay, what is a substitution account? So greater use of special drawing rights might be best suited to encourage a transition to more stable international monetary system by facilitating any desired reserve diversification, establishing on a temporary basis an enhanced substitution US dollar SDR, and so thus diversifying the portfolio. So you know the difference between assets and portfolio, right? So if you are investing in only one, then there is more risk, so that is your asset. Now when you are dividing your investment into many assets, then the whole collection of asset becomes your portfolio, and that is a diversified portfolio, right? So a substitution account would create considerable moral hazard, since reserve holders would be tempted to engage in further accumulation. In addition, a substitution account would not address the fundamental symmetry of the adjustment process. Thus, it would appear essential that a substitution account mark the transition from the current hybrid system to an international system characterized by more flexible exchange rates from the systematic countries. And the last one is a practical solution, that is the formation of the G20 and shared responsibility, right? So what was the agenda here? The G20 framework moves in the right direction. It stresses countries' responsibilities to ensure that their policies support strong, sustainable and balanced growth. Now under the framework, members have agreed to mutual assessment of their monetary enhanced rate, fiscal and financial policies, with the assistance of the IMF, right? So this is how are the different points under the IMF which could help work this international monetary policy and fund to work in favor of different developing countries and help them overcome the problems and walk on the path of economic growth.